You know, all this talk about
We are getting killed on trade.
You know, they'll make cars and they'll sell them to the United States. No tax, no nothing.
Mexico's not happy with me because I talk about the trade deals all the time.
A tariff or whatever you call it. And believe me, China's doing it to us.
I'll take them back from China, from Japan, from Mexico.
I will get Mexico to pay because, frankly, they are taking so much money out of the United States hide. They are taking...
I mean, I love China. How can you not love China?
makes you really think these Mexico and China places are taking American manufacturing jobs right out of their hands. Well, American businessmen have often pushed for free trade to set up factories in cheaper worldwide locations, and throughout the 90s and 2000s, China flooded the world market with cheap labor, cheap work conditions, cheap transportation, cheap exchange rates, and hundreds of millions of workers to become the factory of the world where it seems like everything is manufactured. Made in China became a household name. But what about Mexico? There's a lot of talk about them also stealing American jobs, but no one wants to seem to talk about Mexican development. So let's talk about Mexico. How are they doing? Well, not bad at all, but not great. Mexico is a developing upper middle income country, is one of the top economies by total value made, and has risen in per capita output by 10 times in the last 50 years, but has had an underwhelming rate of growth for the past few decades, some estimates averaging only around 1% per year. There are a bunch of structural reasons for this slow growth, going down to the bone of Mexico. The 70s and 80s were very tough times for many Mexicans, between oil shocks both being affected by the 1973 oil crisis when the Arab countries stopped selling oil to the Americans, giving them rapid inflation and spreading it to Mexico, then the price of oil dropping after they recently became a petro exporter in the late 70s, and then again in 1986, defaulting on its $80 billion debt in 1982, getting hit with the worst earthquake in Mexican history in 1985, and then the tequila crisis of 1994. Not when everyone turned into an alcoholic, but when the government almost ran out of US dollars, which a lot of their debt was owed in, having to drop the fixed conversion rate between the peso and US dollar, which caused the peso to crash to half its value, almost defaulting on its debt again. Mexico had to be bailed out by the US with a $50 billion loan and gave them some of their oil reserves in exchange. So yeah, it wasn't the best time for the Mexican economy, and that's not even including the assassinations, kidnappings, and violence during this instability. It earned the mid-80s to mid-90s the name the Lost Decade, cause where did that whole decade go? And looking at the growth ever since, Mexico has not had their counterpart to the Lost Decade, the posh decade, let's call it. But all that lost stuff is in the past, right? Yes and no. While joining the newly made North American Free Trade Gang, NAFTA has helped them massively grow their output, factories, and trade, the same issues of corruption, inequality, red tape, and violence keep holding them back. Let's go through them quickly. Corruption. Mexico has had a long, complicated history of corruption dating back to Mesoamerican empires taking tribute from smaller cities, usually in the form of forced labor for a small priest and elite class. The Spanish continued that forced labor legacy with the encomienda and repartimiento systems, basically just slavery found especially in Spanish-owned silver mines, a history of various dictators, coups, and wars, and many times political connections choosing who will get rich. For example, who runs the not corrupt at all state-owned oil company Pemex, and the richest man on earth from 2010 to 2013, Carlos Slim, with his political connections being seen as one of the reasons he got so rich, buying up the government-owned telephone monopoly Telmex when they got rid of it, snowballing his wealth from there. Inequality. From corruption, this lack of growth, and very poor social mobility, Mexico is a fairly unequal economy, with the top 10% of earners getting 60% of the pie. One of the biggest reasons for this is because their economy is split. They have the formal economy and the informal economy. Formal goes through the usual bureaucratic processes, pays their taxes, gets their permits, is regulated by laws, and gets benefits for it. And informal firms, they just set up and sell, all under the table. In rich countries, the informal economy makes up a pretty small portion of jobs since it's so hard to hold accountable. But in Mexico, about 60% of workers are in the informal economy, but it only makes up around 25% of GDP. Why do they choose to stay informal? Because of red tape. Formal businesses just have to go through more hoops for not that much to gain. Not only will taxes take an average of 240 hours a year in the formal sector, they would jump from around 2% of income to 30% of income if you start making a fuss that you're a real business. What do they get in exchange for that jump? health insurance, which is just as good as the healthcare you can get for free, a pension but only after 15 years of work, lowered from 25, decent but lackluster infrastructure, especially in the poorer South, the lowest spending per student in the OECD, and Mexico is the only country in the OECD that lacks public unemployment benefits. If you're fired, there's no help for you, so why even bother paying your taxes? It's estimated that 60% of Mexicans do not pay the required amount in taxes. When you live in a country that doesn't encourage you to grow your business, why not just keep it low-key? But how can they provide more services if no one pays their taxes? Chicken and egg situation, I guess. So over 70% of Mexican employment is in what the OECD calls small, medium, and micro firms. These are generally low productivity businesses, maybe with a couple of employees, totaling only 37% of value added in Mexico, often being outcompeted by much larger firms, just adding to the inequality problem. But there's another reason you also might want to stay informal: violence. Mexico has a problem with organized crime rings. You may have heard of armed drug trafficking cartels thriving in the nation, either hiding from or bullying local politicians so that they can set up business. Oftentimes, formal business will attract too much attention from these cartels and will end up having to pay more for extortion charges. Even cartels have taxes? Can you believe that? Organized crime also kills thousands of Mexicans every year, with about 150,000 estimated deaths. Some put that closer to 400,000 since the government declared war on drug cartels in 2006, one of the bloodiest wars of the 21st century. Even hundreds of candidates and politicians have been killed by the cartels in recent years. So drug cartels running large parts of your country isn't the best thing for development. Scenes of fully armed military men patrolling ordinary streets or the Navy guarding beach resorts are not uncommon, and unfortunately it has also meant the Mexican homicide rate has tripled since 2006, but is also spread out unevenly between the states, with Colima, Chihuahua, Guanajuato, and Baja California having the highest number of killings. Each would actually be the world's leading country by homicide rate if they were independent. So from decentralized gangs threatening ordinary people, causing doubt over the stability of the nation, a government that punishes some from doing well, stomping upwards mobility, and the memory of the lost decades still in the minds of many, Mexico has been said to have a fear of growth holding it back from its full potential. Not from the outside, but from the inside. But they may have a golden opportunity to turn the country around if they are open to it, by making stuff. Make stuff now, bring services later. That might be the new Mexican strategy. Okay, that's a total oversimplification. They will always need goods and always need services at the same time. But over the next few decades, it seems like they will have a particular advantage in creating goods and shipping them overseas. Why? To answer that, let's spin the globe and go to East Asia, more specifically to China. China has a stereotype, no, don't think of anything racist, a stereotype of being the factory of the world. Except the stereotype is totally true. China is the world's largest exporter of goods, making up over 10% of all global exports, and is the world's largest manufacturer, with around 28% of the globe's total value welded, soldered, and chemically mixed together inside of China. The bulk of their exports are manufactured goods, electronics, medicine, metal products, cement, and everything at Walmart. They essentially did this by opening up to world trade since the 1990s, most importantly in December 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization and was pressured by members of the WTO to significantly reduce their tariffs and taxes on goods, and allowed more businessmen to buy into the highly regulated market. Tens of millions of low-wage, low-regulation manufacturers were able to flood the world market with Chinese-made goods, along with the yuan being artificially kept almost valueless, made these goods very, very cheap to the rest of the world, who often substituted their own factories and production with this nearly magical Chinese alternative. It was a bold strategy for sure. Keep everything cheap in China and make as many things as possible. Let's fast forward to see if that paid off for them. Oh, would you look at that? The Chinese are rich now, and because of that, there are 3 trends that show China might not hold on to that factory status for long. 1. China is rich. Okay, I get it. China is not as rich as many Western countries and has a substantial amount of wealth inequality, but through their development since the 1990s, a large Chinese middle class has been formed who live at a much higher standard of living than even a couple decades ago, needing more resources to live with and thus needing a higher wage. It makes sense a richer country has more expensive workers. They have a bougier lifestyle. In 2000, Mexican labor was nearly 3 times more expensive than Chinese labor, but now Chinese labor is more expensive by 35%. That's a great thing. It means China has developed and hundreds of millions of people in China are living better lives with more education and higher skilled jobs. It's just that factory work usually isn't considered high skill. Number 2, China is aging. 2022 was the first year where the Chinese government officially announced that there were more deaths than births in China, but analysts have been saying China has been shrinking since the 2010s. This is from a mix of the government-mandated one-child policy from 1979 to 2016 and the cost of raising a child being too expensive in urban and crammed Chinese megacities. The birth rate has crashed, which means people are getting older with less and less younglings to replace them, and typically the older the person, the more educated and highly skilled they are, needing to be compensated for that human capital. Of course, China will still have hundreds of millions of people even after it shrinks. There will always be large manufacturing centers in China, but it will absolutely get more expensive to keep them there, especially as they invest more in sectors like healthcare, education, real estate, and IT, all for domestic consumption as more major parts of their economy rather than just manufacturing for export. And thirdly, probably most important, China and the USA haven't been the best of friends recently. The trade wars in the late 2010s really started to sour the US-China economic relationship, but after that pandemic, there is no hope of recovery for it. Swamped by extra long shipping times from global supply chain issues and full lockdown in China, business people started losing confidence that their Chinese factories were the great investments they once were. Except if you're LeBron James, he still has confidence. Major American companies like General Motors, Intel, and US Steel have been announcing that they're packing up, shutting down factories in China, and heading back to the US. In fact, since 2021, 4 in 5 US corporations have started shifting some production back to the USA, and it has been the American government's policy since the early 2010s to try and reshore manufacturing with incentives like the Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Americans just aren't as confident in the global supply chain as they used to be. So who cares about China's manufacturing and how expensive it is? Well, for one, the USA, and for two, the nation this video was actually about. If there is a major pullback of US investment from China from rising costs and political tensions, then they have two options: start making things inside of the USA or find another cheap country to invest in. And dang it, wouldn't luck have it that there's a country south of the border with plenty of cheap labor and they happen to have a free trade deal with. Mexico right now has a labor force of about 60 million people, and here's the bonus. Unlike China and the US with a median age pushing 40 years old, the median Mexican is less than 30 years old. They're young, and as of right now, relatively low wage. Remember, most Mexicans work in the informal economy, usually for very small firms that can't afford great compensation, and bring with them very low social mobility and a lack of good social programs. So around half of all Mexicans do not have a high school degree, although that number is falling, so progress is being made to a more open Mexico. An injection of good manufacturing jobs into the economy could be a very great thing if managed correctly. Of course, this injection would be almost entirely by the United States. Over 75% of Mexican exports, Mexports, go to the US, along with over half of their imports coming from the States. The US is the leading foreign investor in Mexico, and they happen to share over 3,000 kilometers of border with 5 cross-country railways and 50 vehicle crossings. So it makes sense for the US to invest more into Mexico, huh? Since NAFTA, foreign investment into Mexico has tripled. Since 2009, manufacturing has risen from 15% of GDP to over 18% in 2021, while total manufacturing increased by $100 billion. And they're already a huge exporter of manufactured goods like vehicles, electronics, and chemicals. Mexico is at the right place and right time to potentially have a China-style development with low cost of labor now, but hopefully higher costs and higher standards of living in the future. But they do have some problems they need to deal with in the meantime. Transportation has always been a speed bump to Mexican development, or should I say, a mountain. Surrounded by the Sierra Madres to the east, west, and south, most of Mexico is high up in the air. The land to the north is too dry and the land to the south is too wet, so most of Mexico's population is concentrated here in the middle of the country, which just so happens to be quite far away from the main export market they're trying to reach. Their port capacities are rather lackluster too, with Manzillo, where half of their ocean-bound trade is shipped from, shipping 3 times less cargo than LA does, and the largest port on the Atlantic side, Veracruz, shipping 3 times less than Houston does. But it doesn't matter too much. Most of their stuff coming in and out is with only one other country. They'll just ship it over land, over quite mountainous land, on highways notorious for cargo theft, which the cartels love. To put it into perspective, about $1.8 billion of goods cross over the border every single day. That's over $32 million for each port of entry every day. So maybe investing into better road security and trade infrastructure wouldn't hurt if exports are soon to explode. Another problem, where are they actually going to make these goods? In factories, of course, or maquiladoras. Maquiladoras. To some Mexicans, that's a scary word, one synonymous with exploitation, theft, and awful work conditions. To others, it's a word full of opportunity, skill building, and a chance to move up in the system. So what is a maquiladora? It's actually just a phrase that's short for the Manufacturing Maquila and Export Service Industry Program. In short, a maquiladora is a usually foreign-owned factory given special status to let it access unlimited foreign investment, lower taxes, and maybe a blind eye turn to some regulations. Oops. And big shocker, they're generally owned by Americans who use maquiladoras for labor-intensive factory work while they do the machine-heavy work. The program started in the 1960s to solve chronically high unemployment, only allowing them within 20 kilometers of the border, but have since expanded south beside rail lines and ports since NAFTA was adopted. Today, there are over 3,000 maquiladoras employing around 3 million Mexican workers. That's like one Jamaica of workers, and over 10% of GDP of Mexico is made up of maquiladoras. That's like one Morocco of product. Let's start with the downsides of them. The work conditions, they're not great. Workers are generally given daily, not hourly pay with long hours, health conditions are dubious, housing is often unsafe, foreign ownership is unpopular, and pay has historically been pretty bad, sometimes poverty levels of pay. For the positives, they provide jobs, upwards mobility, and connect Mexico with global, mostly American, markets. The maquiladora was absolutely built on an idea of low-skilled, low-wage work, but has grown to higher-skilled and higher-paying jobs, more than the average informal wage of $3 to $4 an hour. Some plants focusing on the money makers like machinery and metal pay an average of over $5 to $6 an hour, and their effect can be seen on Mexico. States with higher concentration of maquiladoras, especially in the north, have much higher per capita incomes than those in the south, some 4 times more. The level of poverty across northern Mexico is also around half the level of in the south. 15% in Nuevo Leon compared to 66% in Oaxaca and Guerrero. We've already seen how manufacturing and exporting can really change the standard of living in the nation. A cycle of manufacturing to higher wages to better programs to more skills to more manufacturing and jobs. It just needs to be welcomed. And generally, it is welcomed, but there have been a few setbacks. Concerns about being forced to use costly state-run electricity, restrictions on foreign-made steel, aluminum, and vehicle parts being set in the USA, the government canceling a partially built airport in Mexico City, and a lack of confidence from business owners that the government will invest more in infrastructure to transport this new supply of goods. It's a balancing act. They obviously don't want a foreign takeover of all of Mexico's resources, but they also need to show that they're open for business and ready to grow. And the companies are flooding in. Over 400 Asian companies are investing billions into Mexican plants to manufacture for US consumers. After all, made in Mexico tags get into the USA tariff-free. New semiconductor factories are opening in Mexico, aided by the US in their chip war with China. Car companies already building in Mexico include, I don't know,
BMW, Ford, GM, Honda, Mercedes, Toyota, and Volkswagen.
And electric vehicle production could be one of the best new opportunities for this nation, with companies in the US expecting that half of their new sales by 2030 will be in EVs. So GM is investing over $1 billion in an electric vehicle factory in Ramos Arizpe, and Ford is also starting EV production in Cuautitlán, with batteries and drivetrains leading this new investment. Factories just keep opening up with no sign of slowing. The country just has to be ready. Can they properly invest into stronger institutions, social programs, the rule of law, and reducing the informal market to show that Mexico is a stable and safe place to invest in? The last thing the country would want is for the investors to flee from a sudden outbreak of violence in the nation. The fear of growth and punishments for growing must go so that there can be more upward movement out of the informal economy, and hopefully more stable economic conditions can ease the instability in the nation. Of course, growing the manufacturing sector is not a total solution to underperformance, but it is a trend in the right direction, and it's projected that if Mexico can properly invest into these businesses, infrastructure, and formal economy, it could reach a growth rate of over 4%, double to quadruple their recent averages. If it all goes to plan, then maybe Made in Mexico can replace Made in China in American households soon.